High above the bustling terminals and weaving runways of Atlanta's international airport, a quiet story was about to unfold, one that would ripple far beyond the metal shell of Flight 972. 16-year-old Imani Lewis sat quietly in seat 2A, her hands folded neatly over a worn navy blue backpack. She had boarded early, one of the first passengers to step into the polished, leather-lined oasis of the first-class cabin. Everything around her smelled faintly of clean linen and lemon polish. The seat was wide, impossibly soft, the luxury she had only seen in glossy magazines. She wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a gray hoodie, a pair of jeans, and worn sneakers. But there was a pride in the way she sat, a stillness that spoke louder than any designer label. Slung across her chest was a slim lanyard holding her boarding pass, which she tucked carefully into the inner pocket of her hoodie the moment she sat down. This wasn't just a trip, it was a reward. As Camille Harper, her godmother, the woman who had been both mentor and shield, had gifted her this first-class ticket after Imani completed a grueling summer science program with top scores. It was Camille's way of saying, "You belong at the top. Never question it." Imani wasn't one for big shows of emotion, but she even let out a small grin when she first sank into the plush seat. She'd worked hard for this. She deserved it. Outside her window, airport workers moved methodically, guiding carts, loading luggage, signaling aircraft with glowing wands. The engines of a nearby plane hummed as it taxied away, a familiar mechanical lullaby in the distance. Imani rested her headphones around her neck, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of an unopened book resting on her lap. She wasn't reading yet. She was simply taking it all in. Across the aisle, a businessman barked into his phone. His words rushed and clipped. Further down, a mother juggled two restless toddlers, offering apologetic smiles to anyone who caught her frantic gaze. A young flight attendant, fresh-faced and efficient, helped an elderly woman stow her cane and handbag into the overhead compartment. Everything felt normal until it didn't. The sharp click of heels against the cabin floor sliced through the easy rhythm of boarding. Heads turned briefly, instinctively, before snapping back to their worlds. But not Imani. She glanced up and caught the source of the sound. A woman, sharply dressed in a pressed uniform, her hair twisted into a severe bun. Her name tag read, Ms. Carter. There was something about the way Ms. Carter moved, her back straight, her chin lifted, that suggested she believed she owned every inch of the cabin. She swept down the aisle, her eyes scanning the seats like a manager inspecting a showroom. Her gaze flickered over passengers in suits and pearls without pause, offering the occasional tight smile. But when her eyes landed on Imani, she stopped. Just for a fraction of a second, a smile twitched onto Ms. Carter's face, small, almost imperceptible. But as she took in Imani's hoodie, her worn jeans, her brown skin, the smile vanished like mist burned away by sunlight. Her posture stiffened, her eyes narrowed, and her voice, when it came, was just loud enough for neighboring passengers to hear. "Excuse me, miss," Ms. Carter said, arms crossing over her clipboard. "You're in the wrong seat." Imani blinked. She pulled her boarding pass from her hoodie pocket with slow, careful movements and held it up. "This is 2A, she said, her voice soft but clear. Ms. Carter barely glanced at the ticket. Her smile returned, but this time it was brittle, strained at the edges. "This is first class," she said pointedly, ignoring the small laminated card Imani was still holding out. Imani nodded, not understanding. "Yes, ma'am. That's the seat number on my ticket." There was a small, uneasy stir among the nearby passengers. One or two glanced up but quickly looked away, busying themselves with phones, newspapers, or the interesting thread pattern on their sleeves. No one said a word. Ms. Carter's tone sharpened. "Where are your parents, sweetheart?" she asked, as if speaking to a child who had wandered away from the family cabin. Imani's face grew warm, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm traveling alone. My godmother bought my ticket." For a moment, Ms. Carter said nothing. She simply stood there staring. Her nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly. Then, without further conversation, she extended a rigid hand toward the back of the plane. "You need to gather your belongings and move to the economy," she said, her voice clipped, devoid of warmth. "You're holding up the boarding process." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. Imani sat frozen for half a second longer, her heart hammering against her ribs, then slowly reached down and gathered her backpack. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. She ducked her head, the way she had been taught to when facing unfairness too vast to argue against, and walked past Ms. Carter's stiff figure toward the back of the plane. The weight of 100 silent eyes burned into her back. No one said a word. No one stood. And somehow, that silence stung more than the humiliation itself. The economy cabin was already nearly full by the time Imani Lewis made her way down the aisle, clutching her backpack to her chest as though it could shield her from the heavy, unseen weight pressing against her shoulders. She moved like a ghost, quiet, invisible, but feeling every pair of eyes that dared to glance up before quickly looking away. At the very back, she found an open window seat. It was cramped, the cushioning worn thin by years of use, and the overhead light flickered intermittently. Imani slid into the seat without a word, tucked her bag beneath her feet, and pressed herself as close to the window as she could. Outside, the tarmac stretched endlessly under a dull gray sky. Planes rumbled in the distance, their engines a constant, low growl. She stared at them without really seeing. Her throat burned, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. Not when it would only make her feel smaller than she already did. She didn't even have the energy to be angry yet. Mostly she felt hollow. She had done everything right. She boarded on time. She had a valid ticket. She hadn't caused a scene. And yet, it hadn't mattered. For a few long moments, she just sat there, watching the ground crews loading another plane with suitcases heavier than her entire life. Then, almost mechanically, she reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something harder to name, something heavier. She unlocked the screen and opened her messages. The last text she had sent to Camille Harper had been a simple one. "Boarded. Seat 2A. Thank you again." Now her thumbs hovered over the keyboard for a long time before she started typing. "They made me move. Said I didn't belong. I'm in the back now." The words looked so small on the screen, so inadequate for the magnitude of what she was feeling. But it was enough. She pressed send. The moment the message disappeared into the ether, she leaned her forehead against the cool window and closed her eyes. She wasn't sure what Camille could even do. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was already too late. Maybe she'd have to just endure it, the way so many before her had endured it. Her phone buzzed sharply against her palm. A new message. Camille's name lit up the screen. 2 words, sharp as a blade. "What happened?" Imani swallowed hard. She could almost hear Camille's voice in her head, steady, calm, but beneath that calm, a steel that few dared to test. She began typing, thumbs moving faster now. "Flight attendant said I didn't belong in first class. Made me leave. I showed my ticket. Didn't matter." The message was sent with a soft click. Seconds later, Camille responded again. This time just 3 words. "Flight number, now." Imani's breath hitched. There was no question in those words. No comforting, "Are you okay?" No, "Let me think about it." Only immediate, decisive action. She fumbled for her crumpled boarding pass, fingers shaking slightly, and typed the number. 972 ATL to LAX. The reply came back faster than she thought possible. "Stay where you are. Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle it." Imani stared at the screen, the words burning into her mind. Her heart, which had been hammering painfully in her chest, began to slow. Not because she thought everything would magically fix itself, but because she believed Camille. If Camille Harper said she would handle it, she would. Still, as she tucked her phone back into her hoodie and leaned against the window again, doubt crept at the edges of her mind. The plane was already taxiing slowly toward the runway. The engines hummed with growing urgency. What could anyone possibly do now? They were already leaving, weren't they? At the front of the plane, Miss Carter stood near the galley, sipping from a paper cup with a satisfied expression. She straightened a stack of cocktail napkins with slow, deliberate movements, her posture loose, almost triumphant. Nearby, a younger flight attendant, Eric Ramirez, shifted awkwardly on his feet. He had seen the whole thing. had even glanced at Imani's ticket as she held it up, just briefly, before being ordered away. Now he hesitated before speaking. "About that girl earlier," Eric started quietly. Ms. Carter cut him off with a wave of her hand. "She was in the wrong seat," she said briskly, her voice low but hard-edged. "I handled it. 15 years on this job. You learn to spot these things." Eric didn't respond. He just pressed his lips together and stepped away, the words he wanted to say dying in his throat. Back in the cockpit, Captain Douglas reviewed his pre-flight checklist. His mind was on weather patterns, flight routes, and fuel levels, until the call came through. The cockpit's secondary phone, the one marked for urgent communications only, buzzed sharply. Frowning, he picked it up. The voice on the other end was cool, clipped, and unmistakably authoritative. "Captain Douglas, this is FAA operations. Hold your aircraft at the gate. Do not taxi further. Compliance intervention is in progress. You are not cleared for departure." Captain Douglas's eyebrows knit together. This wasn't a routine delay. This wasn't air traffic congestion. This was an order from someone far above his usual chain of command. He turned to his co-pilot, his voice measured but grim. "We're not going anywhere." A few minutes later, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to remain at the gate a little longer due to a minor delay. We appreciate your patience and will update you shortly." A soft ripple of groans moved through the cabin. Passengers checked their watches. Muttered complaints stirred the air. But Imani sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes locked on the blinking seatbelt sign. The delay wasn't about the weather. It wasn't about luggage. It was about her. And somewhere, she knew, this flight wasn't going anywhere. Not until the truth did. From her cramped window, seat in the back of the plane, Imani Lewis could feel it. The shift. It was almost imperceptible at first. A strange tension curled beneath the polite hum of the cabin, a subtle but undeniable friction in the air. It crackled like static, just waiting for a spark. Passengers began glancing around, restless. Some tapped at their phones, searching for updates. Others simply frowned at the lack of movement outside the window. The engines, which should have been vibrating with the eager promise of takeoff, were silent. Still, no one looked at her. No one yet understood. In the first-class cabin, Ms. Carter continued her practiced movements, offering tight smiles and adjusting headrests as though nothing was amiss. But even she began to feel it, the unease threading its way through the cabin like smoke. The delay stretched past 10 minutes, then 15. Ms. Carter finally made her way up the aisle toward the cockpit, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She forced a bright expression as she reached the flight deck, but Captain Douglas didn't smile back. He stood by the open cockpit door, arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he said in a low-clipped voice, "step inside for a moment, please." Passengers in first class looked up briefly, sensing something unusual. A few shifted in their seats. One woman with silver hair and pearls furrowed her brow. Ms. Carter's throat tightened, but she stepped into the cockpit. The door closed softly behind her. Inside, the air was cooler, more sterile. The steady hum of instruments filled the silence. Captain Douglas didn't waste time. He handed her a headset. "There's someone you need to speak with," he said. His voice left no room for negotiation. Ms. Carter placed the headset on, confusion clouding her features. A calm, unfamiliar voice came through the line. "Ms. Carter, this is Deputy Operations Manager Blake Hall, speaking on behalf of Director Camille Harper, FAA Aviation Safety Division." Ms. Carter's heart dropped into her stomach. "We have received a formal discrimination complaint regarding your treatment of passenger Imani Lewis, seat 2A, the voice continued. "We are now intervening directly. Please answer carefully. Did you verify the passenger's boarding pass against the manifest before relocating her?" Ms. Carter opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. I looked at it briefly," she stammered. "It didn't seem right." "Did you verify it through ground control or internal systems before removing her?" Silence. "No," she admitted finally, her voice barely a whisper. The line crackled slightly, then Blake Hall's voice returned, cool and final. "You made a judgment call based on appearance, not procedure. This constitutes a serious breach of FAA compliance standards. Ms. Carter's vision blurred slightly. Effective immediately, you are ordered to escort Ms. Lewis back to her original seat, apologize clearly in the presence of passengers, and restore her boarding status. This aircraft will not depart until this action is completed and confirmed. Furthermore, you are to prepare for compliance questioning upon arrival. Ms. Carter gripped the armrest beside her, her fingers digging into the metal. This wasn't just an internal issue anymore. This was federal. The line went dead. Captain Douglas watched her carefully as she removed the headset, her hands trembling. "Go," he said quietly. "Make it right." Ms. Carter nodded stiffly and stepped back into the cabin, her body moving before her mind could fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. As she walked back down the aisle, she could feel the weight of every gaze turning toward her. Confused, curious, expectant. Her feet felt heavy. Her uniform, once a badge of authority, now clung to her like a reminder of everything she had just jeopardized. When she reached the economy section, she found Imani still sitting quietly by the window, her posture calm, almost regal in its stillness. Imani did not turn to look at her. Not right away. Miss Carter crouched down slightly, forcing a tight, brittle smile. "Miss Lewis," she said, her voice lower, trembling at the edges, "there seems to have been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to your original seat." Imani turned her head slowly, meeting Miss Carter's gaze with a calm that cut sharper than any raised voice could have. For a long, loaded moment, neither of them spoke. Nearby passengers shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen, but everyone was listening. Finally, Imani said, her voice steady, "A misunderstanding." Ms. Carter's smile faltered. I may have misjudged the situation," she admitted, voice brittle. Imani tilted her head slightly, not raising her voice, but allowing the silence to widen the space between them. "You saw my ticket," she said quietly. "You heard me tell you my seat number, and you still made me move." Miss Carter swallowed hard. "I made a mistake," she whispered. Imani studied her for another beat. Then slowly, she reached for her backpack, stood up with quiet dignity, and allowed Miss Carter to lead her back up the aisle. As they moved, passengers along the way turned their heads, whispers trailing in their wake. The girl from the back was coming forward again, but she wasn't walking in shame this time. She was walking in truth. When they reached seat 2A again, Ms. Carter gestured awkwardly. Imani slid into her seat, tucked her bag back under her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. Ms. Carter lingered for a moment longer, her voice barely audible over the tense silence. "If there's anything else you need," she murmured, but the words fell flat between them. Imani said nothing. She didn't need to. Ms. Carter turned and hurried back toward the galley, her steps uneven now. Across the aisle, a few first-class passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly aware of the uncomfortable reality that had unfolded before them. No one said a word. But everything had changed. The cracks had started to show, and the entire flight was feeling them now. And somewhere deep inside her, Imani Lewis understood. The storm hadn't passed. It had only just begun. The heavy click of Ms. Carter's heels faded down the aisle, but the silence she left behind remained, thick and immovable. Imani Lewis sat back in her seat, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight but relaxed. She didn't need to do anything more. Her mere presence in seat 2A was now louder than any argument she could have made. The cabin, once buzzing with casual conversation, had quieted into an unnatural stillness. Passengers fidgeted with seat belts, shuffled newspapers, sipped absent-mindedly from half-empty coffee cups. But no one spoke to her. No one apologized for watching her humiliation earlier. No one offered words of support. Their silence wasn't the polite kind anymore. It was uneasy, weighty, each person confronting their complicity. Outside, a faint drizzle had begun to mist the runway, blurring the sharp outlines of the other planes. The gray sky pressed low against the earth, a fitting mirror for the tension inside Flight 972. In the cockpit, Captain Douglas reviewed his messages from FAA operations with mounting unease. His orders had been clear. The plane would not leave the gate. The compliance officer was en route. Every action taken aboard was now being logged, recorded, and scrutinized. And not just by the airline, by the federal government. Captain Douglas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had flown senators, executives, and foreign dignitaries, but he had never seen a plane grounded for a single teenage girl until today. Behind the galley curtain, Miss Carter leaned heavily against the metal counter, her palms damp with sweat. Her mind raced in frantic circles, replaying every moment, every glance, every word, since she first stopped in front of seat 2A. She had thought she was maintaining order. She had thought she was protecting the standards of the cabin. But now, as she pressed her fingertips against the cool countertop, a different truth gnawed at her. She had acted on instinct, and her instinct had been wrong. In the economy section, whispers finally began to ripple through the cabin. "They're still not moving," a man muttered under his breath. "What's taking so long?" another woman asked. Further back, a middle-aged man leaned toward his seatmate. "It's not the plane," he said quietly, glancing toward the front. "It's her, the girl they moved." His seatmate frowned. "What about her?" He shook his head. "You didn't see it. The way the flight attendant treated her. It wasn't right." The words passed from row to row, subtle as a current, but steady. Passengers who had looked away earlier now exchanged guilty glances. In first class, a woman in pearls, the same woman who had watched Miss Carter so carefully, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She clutched her designer handbag a little tighter against her lap, staring blankly at the back of the seat in front of her. A few seats over, a businessman closed his laptop with a soft, decisive snap. The energy in the cabin had changed. It wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was accountability creeping in at the edges, and everyone felt it. Back in her seat, Imani leaned her head against the window, her reflection barely visible against the glass. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't triumphant. She was simply waiting. Her phone buzzed quietly in her lap. It was Camille. "Hold tight. FAA security is already on the ground." Imani locked the screen again without replying. There was nothing else to say. The storm that had been brewing silently for the past hour was now descending, and she didn't have to lift a finger. Near the galley, Eric Ramirez, the young flight attendant who had witnessed it all, finally found the courage to speak again. He leaned against the wall beside Ms. Carter, keeping his voice low. "You know this isn't going away, right?" he said carefully. Ms. Carter didn't answer immediately. She stared down at her hands, the once pristine polish on her nails now chipped from nervous picking. "I thought," she whispered, then stopped. Eric waited. "I thought I was following protocol," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I thought she didn't belong." Eric's expression didn't shift. "And you didn't ask yourself why you thought that?" he said, his voice soft but sharp. Ms. Carter closed her eyes for a moment, as if the cabin's sterile fluorescent lights had suddenly become too much to bear. In the first-class cabin, Captain Douglas made another quiet announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your continued patience. We are currently addressing a compliance matter and will update you as soon as possible. We appreciate your understanding." The words were polite, professional, but every passenger heard the weight behind them. Compliance matters. Not mechanical, not weather, not security, something deeper, something human. Imani stayed seated, calm, as she felt the ripple move through the plane again. She wasn't the same girl who had been forced to walk to the back earlier. She wasn't invisible anymore, and neither was the truth. At the front of the cabin, the curtain to the galley shifted slightly as Miss Carter peered out, her face pale, her movements jittery. She saw the rows of passengers now sitting stiffly in their seats, some casting her looks she could no longer pretend not to notice. She saw the empty gate outside the window. She saw the black SUV pulling up next to the terminal, its government plates gleaming dully in the rain. She saw the uniformed FAA officers stepping onto the jet bridge. And in that moment, Ms. Carter understood fully. She had not just made a mistake. She had invited a reckoning. The plane remained frozen in place, its engines silent, its wheels anchored stubbornly to the ground. Not because of technical failure, not because of the weather, because a girl refused to be erased, because a system was being forced at last to see her. And somewhere beyond the mounting tension, beyond the drumming of nervous fingers and the rustling of unsettled passengers, The truth hung heavy in the air. This flight would not move until justice did. The cabin doors hissed softly as they unlocked, a nearly imperceptible sound. But to those who were paying attention, it was deafening. Two figures stepped onto the plane. The first was a tall woman, her Navy FARA uniform crisp, every movement deliberate. Her badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Walking beside her was a man in a dark gray suit, his expression unreadable, a slim tablet tucked neatly under one arm. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them needed to. The moment they entered the first-class cabin, the energy shifted yet again. It wasn't like before, a murmur of curiosity, a ripple of impatience. This was something heavier. Passengers straightened instinctively. Some whispered behind raised hands. Others simply sat rigid, their bodies tight with the awareness that something serious had arrived. Imani Lewis sat still in 2A, her gaze steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't hide. She didn't shrink. The FAA officer scanned the rows briefly before stopping in front of Imani. "Miss Lewis?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Imani turned her head, meeting her eyes without hesitation. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "My name is Officer Rhodes," the woman said, her tone professional but not unkind. "We're here on behalf of Director Camille Harper. Please remain seated for now. You will be the last to disembark." Imani nodded once. No fear, no anxiety, only the quiet, anchored strength of someone who knew the storm was no longer hers to weather alone. Without another word, Officer Rhodes and her partner moved toward the galley. They didn't need directions. They already knew exactly who they had come for. Behind the curtain, Ms. Carter's breath caught in her throat. She could hear the footsteps approaching. Each one landed like a hammer against her chest. When the officers appeared, Ms. Carter straightened reflexively, her training kicking in. But it was a hollow gesture. Even her polished shoes seemed to falter slightly against the floor. "Ms. Carter?" Officer Rhodes asked. Yes," she stammered. "You are required to accompany us for questioning regarding a compliance violation involving a minor passenger," the agent in the suit added, his voice even sharper. The word minor seemed to hit Ms. Carter harder than anything else had. This wasn't a simple customer service complaint anymore. It was official misconduct. Possibly worse. Passengers leaned discreetly toward the aisle, pretending to fumble with bags or headphones, but their ears were sharp, their eyes sharper. The entire plane seemed to lean in. Ms. Carter nodded mutely. "Please follow us," Officer Rhodes said. For the briefest second, Ms. Carter's knees buckled. But she caught herself and stepped out from behind the galley curtain, facing the rows of passengers who had once respected her uniform, and who now watched her with cold, silent judgment. As she began walking down the aisle toward the front exit, she passed by Imani. Their eyes met. Not for long, just a flicker. But in that instant, an entire unspoken conversation took place. "You thought I didn't belong. You thought no one would notice. You thought you could erase me." But here she was, still seated, still present, and Ms. Carter was the one being walked off the plane. Ms. Carter lowered her eyes. She couldn't hold the girl's gaze. She couldn't even hold her head high anymore. Passengers said nothing. There was no applause, no gloating, only the deep, echoing silence of a collective reckoning. When Miss Carter reached the aircraft door, she hesitated briefly, half hoping for some reprieve, half wishing to disappear. It didn't come. She stepped off the plane under the watchful eyes of the FAA agents, her figure growing smaller until the cabin doors closed once more, with a final, almost merciful click. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The passengers sat there, bound not by seat belts but by the weight of what they had witnessed, and for most of them, what they had failed to stop. Captain Douglas stepped into the aisle and spoke into the overhead system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin disembarkation shortly. Please remain seated until instructed. Thank you for your cooperation." The tone was calm, practiced, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. This flight wasn't ending the way any of them had expected. Slowly, methodically, row by row, passengers began to disembark. They passed by seat 2A, where Imani still sat, dignified and silent. Most avoided her gaze. Some, however, stole glances that held something different now. Not pity, not sympathy, but respect, or maybe shame. Imani remained where she was, exactly as Camille Harper had instructed. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to prove anything. Justice was no longer something she had to demand. It was unfolding all around her. As the plane emptied, the remaining flight attendants moved about mechanically, their faces strained. Eric Ramirez, who had watched everything from the start, paused by Imani's seat. He didn't try to excuse anything. He didn't offer empty apologies. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, sincere gesture of respect, and kept moving. When the final passengers were gone and only a few crew remained, Officer Rhodes returned. "Miss Lewis," she said gently, "we're ready for you." Imani stood slowly, pulling her backpack onto her shoulder. Her movements were deliberate, composed. She turned once, giving the now empty first-class cabin a final, lingering look. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about being seen and refusing to be invisible ever again. As she stepped into the jet bridge, the cooler air hit her skin, sharp and clean. A line of airline executives, FAA officials, and airport security waited beyond the glass. But standing slightly apart from them, calm and composed in her navy trench coat, was Camille Harper. Their eyes met across the distance, and for the first time since boarding that flight, Imani allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She wasn't walking into a confrontation anymore. She was walking into a new beginning. The hallway leading to the security conference room was cold, brightly lit, and lined with glass windows that offered no privacy. It was designed for transparency, and today, for reckoning. Ms. Carter sat stiffly at the end of a narrow table inside the room, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She was no longer wearing her flight attendant jacket. Without it, she looked smaller, more fragile. Her badge had been surrendered at the door. Across from her sat two FAA compliance officers, Officer Rhodes and her partner, Agent Keller. Between them was a recorder, its red light blinking steadily, capturing every word, every silence. "Please state your name and position for the record," Officer Rhodes said calmly. Ms. Carter cleared her throat, her voice cracking despite her efforts to steady it. "Victoria Carter, Senior Flight Attendant, Northern Skies Airlines." There was a short pause as the officers reviewed their files. "Ms. Carter," Agent Keller began, his tone direct but not aggressive. "You are aware this is a formal compliance investigation under FAA anti-discrimination protocols?" "Yes," she whispered. "And you understand that any false or misleading statements may result in further action?" "Yes," she said again, barely audible. Officer Rhodes leaned forward slightly, her voice neither cruel nor kind, but heavy with the weight of truth. "Please explain, in your own words, why you approached passenger Imani Lewis while she was seated in 2A. Miss Carter swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, like she'd swallowed sandpaper. "I thought," she began, but the words caught. She paused, pressing her palms against her knees. "I thought she didn't belong there." The officers said nothing. They didn't need to. The silence itself pressed harder than any accusation. "And what made you think that?" Keller asked after a beat, his voice deceptively gentle. Ms. Carter hesitated. She could feel every beat of her heart echoing inside her chest. She looked too young," she offered lamely. "And," her voice faltered again, "and she wasn't dressed like the others." Rhodes nodded slightly, making notes, her pen gliding across the paper. "So you based your judgment on her appearance?" Keller pressed. Ms. Carter's shoulders sagged. "Yes." "And you did not verify her boarding pass against the manifest?" Rhodes asked. "No." "You did not consult the ground crew?" "No." "You did not ask for assistance or confirmation from another crew member before removing her?" Ms. Carter closed her eyes for a brief, aching moment. "No." The officers let the silence stretch again, deliberate and suffocating. Behind them, the glass windows looked out into the terminal, where passengers moved about in their small orbits, blissfully unaware that inside this room, a life and a reputation were unraveling, one admission at a time. Finally, Rhodes leaned back slightly, folding her hands. "Ms. Carter, the FAA's concern here isn't just that a procedural mistake was made," she said. "It's that your decision resulted directly from unchecked bias. You removed a minor passenger with a valid ticket from her rightful seat based solely on appearance and assumption. Ms. Carter's hands trembled slightly. I didn't mean to, she started, but Rhodes cut in gently. Intent doesn't erase impact. The weight of that truth crushed whatever feeble defense Miss Carter might have summoned. She sagged back into her chair, defeated. Across the hallway, in another, smaller waiting room, Imani Lewis sat quietly beside Camille Harper. Unlike Miss Carter, Imani wasn't surrounded by harsh lights or pointed questions. Here the atmosphere was calm, almost reverent. Camille had insisted that Imani be treated not as a subject of investigation, but as a witness. Officer Rhodes entered after a few minutes, her clipboard tucked neatly under her arm. Miss Lewis, she said, her tone respectful, would you be willing to provide a voluntary statement about the incident? Imani nodded once. She didn't hesitate. As Rhodes prepared the recording device, Camille gave Imani a small, encouraging smile, but said nothing. This was Imani's moment now. The light on the recorder blinked on. Please, in your own words, Rhodes prompted. Imani's voice when it came was soft but unshakable. I sat down in 2A after boarding, she began. I had my boarding pass out. I didn't cause any problems. I didn't talk loudly. I didn't move anyone else's belongings. I was just sitting there, waiting for the flight to start. She took a breath, steady and even. Then the flight attendant, Ms. Carter, approached me. She told me I was in the wrong seat. I showed her my ticket, but she didn't even really look at it. She told me to move to the back. She didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket, just me. Another breath. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. I didn't argue because... She paused for a fraction of a second, and Officer Rhodes waited patiently. Because when someone tells you that you don't belong, really tells you with their eyes and voice, you know arguing won't change it, so I moved. Rhodes' pen paused briefly on her paper. Imani continued, her voice growing even steadier. But I did belong. I had the right seat. I did everything right. And still, it wasn't enough. Silence stretched between them. A different kind of silence this time. Not the heavy one that had filled the cabin, but a softer, clearer one. The kind that made people listen. Finally, Rhodes spoke. Thank you, Miss Lewis, she said, her voice quieter now. That was very brave. Imani simply nodded. She wasn't seeking praise. She was just telling the truth. And sometimes that was the bravest thing of all. Back across the terminal, Ms. Carter sat alone at the small conference table, staring blankly at the gleaming surface. The officers had left to compile their reports. The door remained ajar, but it might as well have been a cell door for how trapped she felt. She had spent years perfecting the image of control, of authority, and in one terrible, irreversible moment, she had revealed the ugly truth underneath. She hadn't lost control. She had abused it. Outside the window, a plane lifted off into the misty sky, its nose slicing cleanly into the clouds. Ms. Carter watched it rise, the reflection distorted across the glass. She wondered if she would ever fly again, and she knew deep down that the answer was probably no. By the time the formal interviews concluded, the sun had begun to set beyond the vast airport tarmac, casting long golden rays across the terminal glass. The outside world moved forward, unaware that inside a quiet conference room, a fault line had cracked wide open and would not be sealed easily. Imani Lewis remained seated in the small waiting area, her backpack resting against her legs, her face calm but focused. Across from her, Camille Harper scrolled through a series of messages on her phone. Internal updates from FAA leadership, airline compliance officers, and legal consultants. She moved with the effortless precision of someone used to steering institutions through storms. But even Camille knew this was bigger than one investigation. It was a mirror held up not just to Northern Skies Airlines, but to an entire system. Officer Rhodes returned, a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her face, professional as ever, softened slightly as she approached Imani. Miss Lewis, she said, the FAA has concluded its preliminary review. Immediate measures are being taken. Camille looked up, her gaze sharp. Imani, however, didn't flinch. What happens next? Imani asked simply. Officer Rhodes gave a small, respectful nod, an acknowledgement of Imani's right to ask, her right to demand clarity. First, Rhodes said, Ms. Carter's suspension is now official, pending a full disciplinary review. She will not return to active duty until a final decision is reached. There was no triumph in the room, no celebration, only the sober realization that one career had likely ended because of a choice made in a fraction of a second, but fueled by a lifetime of unchecked assumptions. And second, Rhodes continued, Northern Skies Airlines has agreed to immediate corrective actions, including mandatory anti-bias training for all flight crews, policy reforms in ticket verification, and an independent ombudsman process for passenger complaints. Camille arched an eyebrow slightly, approving but skeptical. And the timeline? Implementation starts within 30 days, Rhodes confirmed, under direct FAA oversight. Imani nodded, absorbing every word. But then Officer Rhodes added something unexpected. There's one more thing, Miss Lewis. Director Harper has requested that you participate, if you're willing. Imani blinked, caught slightly off guard. Participate? She repeated. Rhodes smiled faintly, the rare hint of warmth softening her professional exterior. The FAA plans to launch a public education campaign, a reminder that the right to fair treatment isn't conditional. It's fundamental. They want your voice to be part of it. Imani's heart skipped slightly, not out of fear, but out of the staggering realization that this moment, this painful, humiliating experience, could ripple outward in ways she hadn't even imagined. Of course it's voluntary, Rhodes added quickly. You're under no obligation. Imani didn't answer right away. She turned slightly to look out the wide glass wall at the airport beyond. Families reuniting, business travelers hustling past, pilots and flight attendants striding purposefully to their gates. A part of her wanted nothing more than to disappear into that crowd, to return to her normal life, unnoticed, unremarked. But another part, a deep, steadier part, knew. If she stayed silent, it would all happen again, to someone else, in some other seat. She turned back to Rhodes, her voice quiet but firm. I'll do it, she said. Across the room, Camille's lips curved into a small, proud smile, one she didn't need to voice. Officer Rhodes nodded approvingly. I'll make the arrangements. As she rose to leave, Camille leaned forward slightly, her voice pitched low enough for only Imani to hear. You don't have to carry this forever, she said. But what you do with it right now, that matters. Imani nodded once. It wasn't about becoming a symbol. It wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about making sure the next young black girl who sat in seat 2A, or anywhere else, wouldn't have to fight to prove she belonged there. Meanwhile, in a much smaller, dimmer room at the opposite end of the terminal, Victoria Carter sat alone. No badge, no uniform, no authority. Just a plain chair, a blank table, and a stack of official paperwork she had been instructed to read and sign. Among them, a notice of immediate suspension, a warning of pending FAA disciplinary action, and a letter informing her that if the investigation found grounds for misconduct, particularly discrimination against a minor, she could face permanent termination and loss of her flight certification. Ms. Carter stared down at the documents, the words blurring slightly. She had dedicated 15 years to building a career based on rules, procedures, and order. But when the moment came, she hadn't followed any rule except her own bias. And now, everything she had built was crumbling faster than she could grasp. No apology would be enough. No explanation would erase the image burned into every witness's mind. The uniformed woman ordered a quiet girl to move because of how she looked. Ms. Carter set the papers down with trembling hands. She wasn't escorted out in handcuffs. No dramatic scene played out. But she knew the truth. Her career had ended the moment she mistook prejudice for professionalism. At the same time, back at the main terminal, a quiet buzz began to grow. A small team of FAA and airline executives gathered for a preliminary press meeting. Cameras were being positioned. Microphones were tested. In the middle of it all stood Camille Harper, calm, composed, radiating a quiet authority that made even seasoned executives choose their words carefully. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for reform. Today, Camille began as the first cameras flickered to life. We are not just responding to an incident. We are setting a precedent. Discrimination, subtle or overt, has no place at 30,000 feet or anywhere else. Behind her, a simple sign had been erected. It bore only 5 words, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened. Respect has no boarding zone. By the time the first news articles broke, Imani Lewis and Camille Harper were already back home, far from the sterile walls of the airport and the heavy glare of security lights. At first, it was just a few headlines scattered across aviation blogs and regional news outlets. FAA grounds flight over discrimination incident. Teen passenger wrongfully removed from first class sparks federal investigation. Short, factual, easy to scroll past for most, but buried inside the articles were the details that caught people's breath. A black teenage girl, a valid first-class ticket, a flight attendant's hasty judgment, a godmother who happened to be one of the most respected names in aviation safety. It didn't take long for the story to catch fire. By noon the next day, it was everywhere. National morning shows led with it. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags. Shock seat 2A, Shasha respect in the air, just flying while black. Major networks requested interviews. Advocacy groups issued public statements. Civil rights organizations demanded sweeping changes. And in living rooms, boardrooms, and classrooms across the country, ordinary people asked themselves uncomfortable questions. Would I have stood up if I had been on that flight? Would I have spoken up when it mattered? At the heart of it all was a photograph, snapped quietly by a passenger on the jet bridge. Imani was walking with her backpack slung over one shoulder, her head held high, surrounded by federal officials, not in shame, but in dignity. No words, no fist raised in anger. Just calm, just the truth. And it was that image, more than anything, that refused to let the world look away. In a small conference room at the FAA's regional office, Camille Harper sat at a polished oak table surrounded by senior aviation executives and government officials. A large screen on the wall displayed a simple title: Emergency Compliance Reforms, Immediate Actions. Camille stood, walking calmly to the front of the room. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words sliced through the room with precision and gravity. "We prepare pilots for turbulence," she said. "We train them to recognize invisible dangers in the air. But the greatest turbulence we face isn't atmospheric. It's human. It's the assumptions we carry without questioning, the biases we act on without seeing." She let the silence settle before continuing. "If we are to rebuild trust in our skies, we must be as vigilant against discrimination as we are against mechanical failure." There was no applause, just the steady scratching of pens against paper, as every person in that room realized they weren't being asked for input. They were being given their orders. Meanwhile, across the city, Imani sat curled up on the living room sofa, a cup of warm tea in her hands, the television flickering with news reports she tried not to watch. The world had placed her on a stage she hadn't asked for. And while part of her wanted to shrink from it, another part, the part that had stood tall when Ms. Carter tried to erase her, knew she couldn't. Camille entered quietly holding an envelope. "Special delivery," she said, smiling softly. Imani looked up, curious. She set the tea down and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter from the FAA, printed on crisp official stationery. "In recognition of your courage, dignity, and quiet strength, the Federal Aviation Administration extends its profound gratitude. Your actions have not only upheld your rights, but have helped to strengthen the standards for millions of travelers across the nation." At the bottom was a handwritten note, unmistakably from Director Camille Harper herself. "You didn't have to shout to be heard. You didn't have to fight to make change. You only had to tell the truth. And the world listened." Imani ran her fingers over the words, her chest tightening with emotion. She hadn't set out to be a symbol. She hadn't wanted to lead a movement. She just wanted to sit in her seat. But sometimes the smallest refusal to move, to be silent, to be invisible, was enough to shift an entire system. In the following weeks, tangible changes began to sweep through the airline industry. Mandatory bias and anti-discrimination training for all crew members reviewed and overseen quarterly. Double verification boarding procedures to prevent arbitrary challenges based on appearance. A new hotline for passengers to report discrimination anonymously, with mandatory response protocols within 24 hours. FAA monitors assigned to randomly audit flights for compliance. Airlines scrambled to issue public apologies, not just to Imani, but to passengers everywhere who had ever been made to feel unwelcome, unseen. But Imani didn't give interviews. She didn't accept speaking tours or endorsement deals. Instead, she chose something quieter and stronger. At a local community center, without cameras or fanfare, she began mentoring younger girls, teaching them not just about science or aviation, but about standing in their truth. Sometimes, she told a circle of wide-eyed 12-year-olds one evening, "You'll walk into a room where no one thinks you belong. That's not your problem to fix. It's theirs." Back at Northern Skies Airlines, a different reckoning was underway. Victoria Carter's termination was made public in an internal memo to all staff. Failure to comply with FAA discrimination policies, violation of passenger rights, breach of professional conduct. The memo didn't name Imani. It didn't mention race. It didn't have to. Everyone already knew. And more importantly, everyone knew now that silence, the kind that once protected prejudice, would no longer be tolerated at 30,000 feet. The skies weren't perfect, but they were changing. Because a 16-year-old girl, armed with nothing but a valid boarding pass, quiet dignity, and a godmother who refused to be silent, made them listen. And once the truth is heard, it cannot be unheard. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow-moving tide, not a crashing wave, but a steady, unstoppable swell. At first, the public conversation was cautious. A few think pieces here, a panel discussion there. Some framed it as an isolated incident. Others dared to say what so many had always known, that it was not an accident, nor a misunderstanding. It was a mirror held up to a reality too often ignored, and people saw themselves in it. The story of Imani Lewis sitting quietly in her rightful seat, only to be forced out because she didn't fit someone's idea of belonging, struck a nerve deeper than even the FAA had anticipated. Soon the hashtags evolved beyond just seat 2A. They became part of a larger conversation. Belonging is not conditional. Right to remain. Respect in the air. Imani's face, that quiet, composed image captured on the jet bridge, appeared on news segments, in opinion articles, in social media posts. And though she refused interviews, her silence said more than 1,000 press conferences ever could. She had already spoken. They had just finally started listening. At a cafe 2 blocks from her school, Imani sat with Camille, both of them sipping hot chocolate as the world outside buzzed with 1,000 invisible threads of conversation. A small TV over the counter played a news segment. Imani glanced up at the screen and caught the headline. "Former passengers speak out. We should have said something." The anchor read excerpts from a series of statements that had started circulating, letters and social media posts written by passengers who had been on Flight 972. One read, "I saw what happened. I saw her being asked to move without cause. I didn't say anything. I regret it every day." Another, "At the time, I told myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. Silence protects the wrong people." And another, "To Imani Lewis, you showed more courage than all of us combined." Imani stared at the screen, emotion flickering across her face. Not anger, not pride, but something heavier. A quiet recognition of how much power silence could hold, both to harm and to heal. Camille leaned forward, her voice low. "They're not just apologizing to you," she said. "They're waking up to themselves." Imani nodded slowly. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse, but she knew it mattered. Meanwhile, at Northern Skies Airlines, an internal transformation was underway. The CEO had been forced to address the company's leadership in a closed-door meeting. There, for the first time, the terms racial profiling, implicit bias, and structural discrimination were spoken aloud in a room of executives who had spent their careers pretending such things were rare anomalies. New training modules were rolled out, not the superficial check-the-box sessions of the past, but real, grueling workshops led by external civil rights organizations. Flight crews were required to complete multi-day bias training before returning to service. Boarding procedures were rewritten. Customer service guidelines were rewritten. The very language used to describe passengers was being rewritten. And sitting quietly behind all of it was the memory of a 16-year-old girl who had refused to be invisible. Late one evening, as the sky bled into deep indigo, Imani sat by her bedroom window, scrolling through the quiet aftermath. Not the news articles or the viral posts, not the outrage, but the quieter messages, the ones sent directly to her. Messages from teenage girls who had seen themselves in her. Messages from mothers thanking her for showing their daughters what dignity looked like. Messages from elderly passengers admitting that they had remained silent for too long. One message caught her breath. "I was in seat 5C. I watched it happen. I didn't stand up for you. I should have. I'm sorry. I hope someday you'll know that you changed me." Imani placed the phone down gently on her nightstand. She closed her eyes and let the weight of those words settle, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. A week later, Northern Skies Airlines hosted a private event at their headquarters, a formal acknowledgement of the changes implemented, an unveiling of new internal reforms. Imani wasn't asked to attend, but Camille was. Standing in front of a room filled with executives, media, and FAA officials, Camille delivered a speech that wasn't loud, but was impossible to ignore. "Policy changes are important," she said, her voice calm and cutting. "Training modules matter, but none of this is enough if it doesn't change the smallest moments, like how you see the quiet girl sitting in 2A. She paused, letting her words sink into the polished walls and uncomfortable suits. "And if you need a reminder of why this matters," she added, her voice softening just slightly, "remember, it wasn't an engine failure that grounded Flight 972. It was judgment. It was an assumption. It was silence. And it was one girl's refusal to disappear that forced the system to finally stop." A slow, scattered applause broke out. Not thunderous, not sweeping, but real, genuine. The kind of applause that said, "We see it now. We cannot pretend we don't." Later that night, back at home, Camille found Imani sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a cup of tea warming her hands. The night was cool, the stars pricking holes in the deep velvet sky. Camille sat down beside her without a word. For a long time, they just watched the darkness stretch and breathe around them. Finally, Imani spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was it worth it?" Camille didn't answer immediately. She leaned back, looking up at the endless black sky. "Change isn't measured by headlines," she said. "It's measured by the spaces people walk into after you and feel safer because you walked there first." She turned to Imani, her gaze steady, fierce with pride. "And you, my dear girl," Camille said, "you didn't just walk into a space, you carved a path through it." Imani smiled, a real one this time. Not because the world had magically fixed itself, but because she understood now, you don't have to move mountains to move the world. Sometimes you just have to stay seated. The morning was clear and bright, the kind of morning that made the world feel clean and full of possibilities. Imani Lewis adjusted the collar of her jacket as she stepped into the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. The marble floors gleamed under the soft sunlight, pouring through tall glass windows. Everywhere she looked, the air buzzed with quiet purpose. Pilots, inspectors, engineers, officials moving with focused energy. And today, she wasn't just another traveler passing through. Today, she had been invited. Camille Harper walked beside her, her steps steady and calm. Camille had attended 1,000 meetings in places like this before, but this one, she had insisted, wasn't about her. It was about Imani. Inside a large conference hall, rows of chairs were filled with airline executives, government officials, advocates, and press members. A simple stage stood at the front, adorned only with a single banner, dignity in every seat. When Imani and Camille entered, heads turned. Whispers rippled through the room, not of gossip, but of recognition. They knew who she was. They knew why they were here. At the podium, Director Evelyn Rhodes, a woman who had built her entire career fighting for safer, fairer skies, smiled warmly and gestured for Imani to approach. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs. For a brief moment, she wanted to retreat, to disappear into the crowd. But then she remembered the plane, the silence, the moment she stood alone in seat 2A when no one believed she belonged, and how she had stayed anyway. She took a breath, and she walked forward. The room stilled. Cameras clicked quietly. Director Rhodes' voice carried clearly across the hall. Today, she said, we honor not just a passenger, but a principle. She paused, letting her words settle. A principle that respect is not earned by clothing, by age, by assumptions. It is not negotiated at the boarding gate. It is not questioned in seat 2A or any seat. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd. Director Rhodes turned slightly toward Imani. Imani Lewis, she said, for your courage, composure, and quiet insistence on your dignity, the Federal Aviation Administration formally recognizes you with the inaugural Courage in Aviation Award. Applause broke out, real, full, heartfelt. Not out of pity, not out of guilt. Out of respect. Imani stepped up to accept the small, clear crystal award. It caught the sunlight and scattered it across the walls in quiet, beautiful patterns. She held it lightly, almost reverently. She hadn't come seeking it. She hadn't fought for it, but she had earned it. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but steady enough to fill the room without needing to rise. I didn't set out to make a statement, she began. I just wanted to sit in my seat. A few people smiled, their faces lit with quiet admiration. I didn't want attention. I didn't want headlines. I just wanted what everyone deserves. To be seen as who I am, not judged by who someone assumes I'm not. She paused, letting the silence gather its weight. And if my story has taught anything, she continued, I hope it's this. Sometimes the strongest stand you can take is to simply stay seated. The room rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition for the truth she had lived, and now shared. Later, in the quieter moments after the event ended, Imani and Camille stood together outside the building, the sun warm against their faces. A steady stream of people passed by, pilots, executives, passengers, many of them nodding respectfully, some offering quiet words of thanks. But it wasn't the attention that mattered. It was the understanding that followed it. The way people saw her now, not just as a girl who had been wronged, but as a young woman who had demanded, without ever shouting, that the world do better. Camille handed her a small envelope. For you, she said simply. Imani opened it to find a letter, not from the FAA, not from a politician, but from a girl in Chicago, handwritten in looping, uneven script. I'm 12. I saw what happened to you on the news. Sometimes I'm scared to raise my hand in class because people look at me like I don't belong there. But you made me think maybe I should anyway. Thank you. Imani's chest tightened. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her jacket. Not fame, not awards. This was what mattered. As they walked toward the parking lot, Camille glanced sideways, a teasing glint in her eye. So, she said casually, what's next for the girl who grounded a flight without saying a word? Imani laughed softly, the sound easy and free. I think, she said thoughtfully, I'll just keep taking my seat, wherever I want. Camille smiled, slipping an arm lightly around her shoulders. And maybe, Imani added, her voice full of quiet certainty, help a few others find theirs too. Above them, a plane sliced cleanly across the sky, its wings catching the sunlight, soaring higher and higher into the blue. It was a good day to fly. And finally, it was a good day to belong. Story message Imani Lewis's journey was never about fame, revenge, or spectacle. It was about dignity, the quiet, powerful kind that doesn't demand attention, but commands it by simply existing. Her story reminds us that injustice doesn't always come with shouting and violence. Often, it arrives quietly, wrapped in assumptions, hidden under uniforms and procedures. And when it does, true courage isn't always about raising your voice. Sometimes it's about refusing to shrink. Imani didn't ground a plane by yelling. She didn't dismantle a system with protests or anger. She did it by refusing to move, by believing in her right to be exactly where she was, and by trusting that telling the truth would be enough. In a world that often rewards noise and chaos, her story is a profound testament to the power of quiet strength, dignity, and truth. She didn't just reclaim her seat, she made the entire system confront itself and change. Practical lessons. 1. Dignity is not conditional. Respect isn't something to be earned based on how you look, dress, or speak. It is a basic right, and challenging discrimination begins with recognizing when that dignity is denied. 2. Silence can either protect injustice or dismantle it. The silence of bystanders allowed Imani's mistreatment to happen, but her silence, the calm refusal to accept injustice, forced the world to listen. What we do with our silence matters. 3. Real change often begins quietly. Change isn't always the result of grand gestures. Sometimes it starts with a single small act of resistance. A girl staying in her seat, a voice refusing to disappear, a truth told without apology. And that ripple can spread farther than shouting ever could. 4. Systems don't change until individuals are brave enough to stand or stay seated. It took one teenager's quiet stand to force reforms across an entire industry. Your voice, your presence, your truth, even when quiet, has the power to challenge and change entrenched systems. 5. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's choosing truth anyway. Imani was scared, but she stayed. She spoke the truth when asked, and that truth reshaped an entire conversation. Closing reflection. Imani Lewis's story teaches us that you don't have to roar to be heard. You don't have to lead marches or light up headlines to make a difference. Sometimes the strongest, most revolutionary thing you can do is sit where you rightfully belong, hold your ground quietly, and trust that the truth will do the rest. Because once the world is forced to truly see you, it can never again pretend you were invisible.